Hey CodeCrew, in this lesson we're going to do quite a bit. We're going to review the YouTube Data API together, and then we're going to create all of the classes and structures in our Xcode project that we're going to need in order to work with the API. And finally, we're going to implement the API call to the YouTube Data API so that we can fire off the call from our app and see if we can get a response. And I'm also going to show you a cool network debugging tool that's going to come in really handy for working with APIs in the future. Just a quick note, if you're jumping into the series at this point, you kind of need to watch these lessons in a progression for it to make sense. First, make sure you've watched the 29 lesson beginner series to get the basic skills. Then make sure you're watching this YouTube app one day build lessons in order. Links to both of these playlists will be in the description. All right, let's start by looking at the YouTube API. If you just Google YouTube API, you'll find this YouTube Data API result. That's the one we want. Click into it. And actually, one thing I want to explain, if you don't know what an API is, I've got a video, I'll put it on the screen right now, that describes to you what it is. It's basically a way for you to interact with other platforms such as Twitter, Facebook, Spotify. You can pull data from the platform, you can write data to it, but that API really controls what you can do. And each platform is different, so there's documentation for each API on each platform. So this is the YouTube one. Let's go down to APIs Explorer to see what we can do with this API. Now, before we dive into the endpoints on the left-hand side for the API, I just want to draw to your attention that every time you make an API call to the YouTube API, you need to specify some sort of identification. Now, that comes in one of two forms, either an API key or an OAuth token. So in terms of the API key, that's something that you can sign up for free, and it identifies you as the developer. So every API call that your app makes to the YouTube API will have that API key, and it's going to identify your app. This is to make sure that they can identify who accesses the API and also to set limits for each key. Again, that's something that you can sign up for free. However, with an API key, you're limited in what you can do. You can only read data. If you want to insert, update, or delete data on the platform, then you need to also use this second form, or rather, instead, to use that form of authentication. And this is where the user actually signs in. So I'm sure you've used apps before where you actually have to, maybe like Instagram apps or YouTube apps, where you have to sign in with your account. And that's what this is. And the reason why this is needed to insert, update, or delete requests is because those actions are associated with a specific person, right? So if a person wants to subscribe to a channel, that action, writes some data to their database, but they have to identify, who is subscribing. So that's why they need to sign in and generate this OAuth token. For our demo app right here, an API key will suffice because we're only pulling data from the API. We're reading the playlist data and the video data, so we will be using this form of authentication. All right, on the left-hand side, there are various endpoints where you can get data from and write data to, channels, you can see playlists, playlist items, videos, and so on and so forth. The one we're actually interested in for this app is playlist items. Now, this endpoint right here, this endpoint only gives you information about the playlist. It doesn't actually tell you what's inside. And so that's why we want playlist items. So let's dive into one of these documentation pages. In your own time, you can dive into these individual pages if you'd like, but all of them follow the same format in terms of the documentation. First of all, it explains to you what this endpoint is, why you would want to use it. And also it tells you the different methods you can do with this endpoint. So listing is just gathering info or reading info, inserting, updating, and delete. That's pretty self-explanatory. And then in terms of the response that you get, it's in JSON format. This is an example of a response. If you don't know what JSON is, again, I have a video for that. It usually goes hand in hand with working with APIs because APIs usually return data in a format like JSON. So if you haven't seen that before, I'll put the video on the screen and you can learn more about JSON and how to read it. So yes, this is an example of it. The other cool thing that you can do is you can actually try this API. So for example, if you click list right here, there will be this API Explorer pane on the right hand side. You can actually just click this blue button to bring it back up. Now, each API call has a set of parameters, right, that you need to specify. Some are required, some are optional. The ones in red are required. So let's take a look at what this required parameter is and what sort of info you need to pass in. If you scroll down a little bit, there's this table here called required parameters, and part, you can read what it means here. But in general, or basically, it dictates how much data you want to get back for each video playlist item. So for us, we're going to want snippet, and that's going to give us the at least the video ID, the thumbnail, the title, description, the published date. Those are the pieces of info that we want. And with specifying snippet, it's going to contain all of the properties we need. I think content details is the most in-depth one. Now, the reason you wouldn't just want to specify the most in-depth one is because the more data that you need coming back, the longer the API call is going to take. And plus, I mentioned the quota. It might take more quota points. In this case, specifying snippet costs 2 units and content details also cost 2 units. But again, I don't need that much detail, and I would rather have the API call come back faster. All right, so let's try it. So in here, I'm going to specify snippet. For the rest of these, I don't need to specify except playlist ID. You scroll down, this specifies the unique ID of the playlist for which you want to retrieve the playlist items. So I definitely want to specify that. The playlist I want to get is actually my most recent uploads from my channel. And I'll show you how to get the playlist ID for any channel. So whenever you click on a playlist on YouTube, so let's just go to mine first. I'm going to go to my channel, click on videos, and then I'm going to click on play all. And when you do that, let me just pause that. At the top, you're going to see a parameter called list, and that represents playlist. So you see list equals, and then you're going to see an ID. This is the playlist ID. So let me just copy that and go back here and specify that as my playlist ID. Now, again, there are those 2 different ways you need to identify yourself, either OAuth token or API key. Since we haven't signed up for an API key yet, we're going to do OAuth. So when you execute this, it's going to pop up a little window for you to sign in with your YouTube account so it can identify you. And so this action, requesting data from this playlist, is going to be done against your account, right? So it can identify that you're the person who's doing it. So I'm going to choose execute. It's going to pop up. So I'm going to go ahead and choose my account. And I'm going to grant permission to it to execute that API call. And here you can see the response is 200, which represents it was a success. And you can see the response that has come back. Now this is JSON right here with all the data. You can see in particular this key items contains all of our video items. It's an array. If you know how to read JSON, that square bracket is the start of an array, and inside the array are the data for each of the videos. So here is, let's see, here's the published date. We're going to need to change that to a pretty date. There's the title of the video, description of the video, thumbnails, different resolutions. And also, if you scroll down a little bit more, there is the video ID. And this is something we're going to need in order to play it, the video. Clicking show code is actually very interesting because it's going to also show you, well, it's going to give you a bigger window, which lets you see the data in a better way. But it's also going to show you the exact API call that it made. So if you take a look at this, this is the API URL, for the playlist items endpoint, and you can see the parameters that we specified. Here's snippet. Right here is playlist ID, and that points to my playlist. And the last parameter is key. we're going to be using API key like I mentioned, and we're going to be pasting that key in here. So we're going to take note of this URL because we're going to specify this inside of our Xcode project for the app to call. All right, so why don't we actually dive into our Xcode project? This is the project we created from the last lesson. And the first thing we're going to do is create a brand new file, a constants file, to store all of the configuration details so that we can update them from one place if we need to. And that way we don't have these hard-coded strings floating around, basically pieces of text. If we need to specify that API key more than once, we can use the constant instead. So I'll show you how to do that. It'll make more sense. Let's choose Swift file and let's choose constants. And then here we're going to create a new struct called constants, and we're going to specify our API key here, make a static var. Some people like to use all capitals to specify their constants, and you can definitely do that. It's really a stylistic preference choice. Just make sure you're consistent with it. In this case, I will do it in all caps. So we have our API key, we have our, and in case you're wondering, if you're not sure what this keyword means, the basic gist of it is that we're going to be able to access these variables without having to create a new instance of constants. So it's perfect for what we need here. Okay, so we have also playlist ID, and then we're going to have the API URL. Okay, so let's start filling in some of these details. So if we go back to this, I mentioned we're going to need this URL, so I'm just going to copy this guy right here. And that is our API URL. But we're going to replace some of the data in here with these two other constants here. So for example, this playlist ID, we can extract it from this URL just in case, in the future we want to change it. So I'm going to cut that and paste it right there. And instead, I'm going to replace it. Make sure you don't lose your place, right? Equals, and I'm going to sort of substitute that variable constants dot playlist ID, right? That's how we're able to access this variable, right, without creating a brand new instance of constants. This is how you would do it throughout your project. Same thing with API key. Instead of API key, we would actually put the API key in there once we have it, but we would do that right here. All right, so now we have to actually sign up for an API key, right? And then we'll be able to start hitting this API. Okay, so how do we do that? If you go all the way back to overview, where it told you how to call the API, you'll see this link to the developer console. By clicking this, actually, I'm going to just open it in a new window. It might ask you to sign in, but creating an API key is free and it's pretty straightforward. All right, so this is taking too long to load, so I'm just going to close it and use the window that I had that was open. So you should see something that looks like this. Go up here under API project, and what you want to do is create a brand new project that represents your app here. So I'm going to call this YouTube API Demo 2 since I've done this twice. Let's click create, and it's going to start creating your project. So you can see here I created one just an hour ago, preparing to record this video. So give it a second. All right, it's done. So you can either click view, or here in the drop down you should see it here. So go ahead and click into your new project, and this is where you're going to choose the APIs you want to work with in this project. So click enable APIs and services, and let's look for YouTube, and we're going to choose YouTube Data API v3. So go ahead and hit enable as soon as the button's going to show up. Boom. And then, all right, after that, you're going to click credentials here, and you're going to generate a brand new API key. See, you have nothing here. Click create credentials, and then choose API key. I'm going to copy this and then I am going to just change the browser window, go back here, and I'm going to paste it. All right, at this point we are done with our constants file. So now let's go and create some of the classes we'll need to work with this API. The first one we're going to need is a class to represent each of the videos that we are going to get from the API. So let's create a new struct called video. So let's choose new Swift file, and we're going to name this video. And this is going to be a struct called video. And we're going to put the properties that we need in here. Earlier, I mentioned the ones that we need, and we looked at the JSON response from the API, and I pointed out all of the different places we're going to need to pull that information out, right? If you remember, it was video ID, it was the title of the video, it was the description of the video, it was also the thumbnail URL, and lastly, it was the published date. So we'll just call this published. So this struct is going to represent, each instance of this is going to represent a video that we're going to display. Next, we're going to create a model class, which is going to actually make the API call and pull back the data and then send it over to the ViewController. So let's go ahead and choose new file. Let's choose Swift file again, and we're going to create the model. This one's going to be a class. And right now we'll just have one function called getVideos. And in here we're going to make that API call. Now if you watch that JSON video about parsing JSON, we show an example of making an API call, or it might have been the API video. In either case, you'll find the links for them in the description below. But the iOS networking classes we need are URL. So first we need to create a URL object, and this points to the endpoint, right, of that the YouTube data API. And then we're going to need to get a URL session object, and URL session is a class that basically does all of the networking stuff. I don't actually know the inner workings of it, to be honest with you, but it contains does all of the networking heavy lifting. Get a data task. A data task represents a single call to the API. And fire or kick off the task. And this is very important because I always forget to do this. I create the data task and I write the code for what happens when the response comes back, but I always forget to kick off the task. So this is gonna make sure that I remember. All right, so let URL equals URL, a new URL object, and there is this initializer where you just pass in the string. It returns an optional URL object, so it may create it, it may not. Let's go ahead and specify our API URL. And because this may be nil, so let's guard against that. Guard URL not equals nil, else. For now, I'm just going to return. Let session equals URL session dot shared. Oh, before I do that, let me just show you what it is. Shared singleton session object, and if I just put my cursor on this, we should be able to see object that coordinates a group of related network data transfer tasks. Provide an API for downloading data and uploading data to endpoints indicated by the URLs. All right. Now we're going to create a data task. So let data task equals, and we create one, the session, the URL session. It has a method called data task where you pass in the endpoint URL you want to hit. There's this one, but this one doesn't give us a chance to write code for what happens when it comes back. And so I actually really want to use this one instead with this completion handler parameter. So let's double click that. And for the first parameter, we're going to specify URL. For the second parameter, we get to specify a closure or a block of code to handle the response. So in this response, we're going to get 3 input parameters. We're going to get the data contained in the response. We're going to get the URL response object itself, which will give us the status code and other information with the HTTP response that we get back. And finally, an error parameter that contains any sort of error if it would have happened. So let's double click that to open up a new closure. And I'm going to give names to each of these parameters. So let's say data, response, and error. Now the first thing we want to do is just check if there were any errors. So if error is not equal nil, that means there is an error. Or maybe the data is nil, there's no data, then we are going to return. We probably should log some sort of error, but for now, as we're building, I'm just going to set a breakpoint. If it ever happens in here, then it will stop execution, and then we can peek in and see what's wrong. And before we go on parsing the data into video objects, before we do that, why don't we kick off the task, data task.resume, to kick it off, and just see if the app is able to hit the endpoint and come back with a response. So inside ViewController, let's create a new instance of model and call that method so that we can actually kick off that network call. So var model equals a new model object, and in view.load, let's go model.getVideos. Let's set let's set a breakpoint right there. All right, and the way we're going to see if it was a success is to basically use a network, what do you call these things? A network debugging tool. I have one called Proxyman, and you can get different ones. There's Charles, Proxyman, and I can't remember some other ones, but this one has a really nice UI, and I'm still using the free version. It's perfectly okay. What this will do is just monitor the traffic coming in and out of your computer or different apps, and allow you to see what's the request, what's the response, and then it's really helpful when you're trying to debug network calls with your apps. So let's go ahead and run this app in the simulator, and hopefully we're going to see it show up in Proxyman, and then we can take a look at the network call. Okay, so first of all, it's hit this endpoint. It hasn't made the network call just yet. I'm going to continue execution like that. And okay, so it's made the network call, and we actually have an error. So actually, let me see what that error is. An SSL error has occurred and a secure connection to the server cannot be made. What was the URL that we had? Was it? No, the API URL is under HTTPS, so okay, that's a little strange. But let's go to Proxyman and take a look to see if we can see that. So you can see here under apps, this is the our app in the simulator. So let's go ahead and pin this guy. Pin it so we can see it at the top always. And before we can actually peek into it, we have to install a certificate to see the HTTPS response. So let's go ahead and do that. So that they make it really easy here. Install to iOS simulators, installed successfully, reset simulators, boom. So those are the 3 steps. All right, so let's launch the simulator. What I'm going to do is just rerun my project here. Oh, that was Pro Max. That was a completely different simulator. Okay, so let's continue execution to fire off the network call. I'll just remove that breakpoint. And yeah, and here, see, this is the network call that just went out. And so we can see what the request and response was. Okay, so the request, you can see here, this is the request, right? With the snippet, with the playlist ID, and actually with my API key. And let's take a look at the response. So here is the response, right? We can take a look at the body. You can see this time it didn't error out. For some reason, the first time we ran it, you can see it was this one, it's red, and we got that error. This one is status code 200, right? It was completed successfully. And in the body, we can see, this is all the data that we need, right? So now we've confirmed that our app can hit the YouTube API and make that call, and the parameters are correct. We're getting the JSON response that we need. So now what we need to do is just parse this JSON response into those video objects, and then we can send it to the ViewController to display. Wow, we've done quite a bit in this lesson. From here on out, I think it's going to be pretty smooth sailing, to be honest. If you want to grab my project, there's a link to it in the description below. Just one note, I've removed my YouTube API key. You're going to have to create your own and then put it in the constants file. All right, now I want to turn it over to you. Now that you've gotten a taste of what the YouTube Data API is like, is it easier or is it harder than you imagined? Let me know by leaving a quick comment below. Now in the next lesson, we're going to start displaying those API results in our UI. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it. Thanks for watching all the way to the end, and I'll see you in the next lesson.